It is rare in any generation to have a scholar who is able to shift the prominent paradigms of a field. Kris Gutierrez is such a scholar. Kris has demonstrated and led us as educators and educational researchers in creating the learning spaces that are needed to support the unique and diverse individuals to be ready for the global and digital context of the 21st century. A vision of hybrid communities thoughtfully and intentionally designed and implemented has dominated Kris's research. But her commitment to such learning spaces is not simply an academic one. She has worked assiduously to create, grow, and sustain spaces where individuals who have typically been excluded from communities of power can be honored members, and where their true identities and voices can be expressed, heard, and grown through mentorship. It would require a symposium to do justice to all of the communities of which Kris has been a creator, mentor, and member. A comprehensive overview of Kris's contributions to these communities can be found in the current Literacy Research Association yearbook. But I want to highlight several of these communities to illustrate the breadth and depth of Kris's commitment to unique, hybrid, functioning, and vital communities. Kris has been involved in community building at the very highest level of the American educational research community. She was nominated by President Obama, confirmed by the U.S. Senate, and served as the vice chair of the governing board of the Institute of Educational Sciences. Within academia, Kris has been part of building communities within the most influential and prestigious networks of colleagues, including the National Academy of Education and the Center for Advanced Study. Barbara Rogoff describes the creation of a community with Kris in the following manner. We spent a year at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences together with Fred Erickson. In daily conversations, we puzzled together about big questions regarding the nature of learning, the improvement of schooling, the organization of out-of-school learning, and cultural paradigms in family and community relations. As I reflect on collaborating with Kris, the extent of our partnership is much bigger than 2 papers. I've learned so much from Kris. Within the university where Kris has been on the faculty, she has created learning communities that have supported numerous graduate students in becoming prominent scholars in eminent universities, undergraduates in completing programs and entering careers in graduate programs, and as part of research programs, high school students in entering prestigious baccalaureate programs. Mariana Pacheco, now a professor at the University of Wisconsin, describes being part of the space that Kris created for students in the following manner. Kris always had Latinx undergraduates working in her office. As Latinx graduate students, we were in regular contact with the undergraduates because she believed that we served as role models for them, that they could learn and experience graduate school life and intellectual engagement from us, and perhaps inspire them to pursue grad school in the future. As I interviewed Kris's former students and colleagues for this introduction, I have to admit to being tempted to go back to graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, where Kris now holds the Carol Liu Chair in Educational Policy, so that I could become a member of the close-knit and intimate group that is made up of Kris's graduate students. From the most prestigious groups to the humblest, Kris creates communities that are marked by intimacy and shared commitment. Kris is the only individual I know who can create a community on Facebook with 3,000 individuals where I feel like I'm part of something much bigger than myself. Kris's accolades from organizations and her partnerships with prestigious scholars and policymakers are exceptional and extraordinary. To me, as noteworthy as these accolades and accomplishment is her ongoing commitment to the community which gave her birth and which she has birthed literally. She is a most committed daughter, mother, and grandmother. Kris epitomizes the best of what it is to be human, the best of what it is to be an educator, and the best of what it is to be a scholar whom we recognize for her lifetime contributions to our field. Please join me in acknowledging Kris Gutierrez.
Thank you. They promised me they were going to take the lights down a little bit. It's hard to see. Can we turn them down just a tad? Yes. So I know I learned from a mentor never to start with an apology slot, but I do want to say today that whatever flu is hanging around Tampa, I caught. So let's pretend that the feverish perspiration that you see is instead my reaction to the weight of this lecture. Okay, I guess they're working on. Yes, they're going to turn them down? Just so I can see my paper. Colleagues, I begin my remarks today by giving thanks to the many people who have inspired and supported my work, which can only be considered a collective accomplishment. First, my son Scott, my granddaughter Akira, grandson Kaiden, my 92-year-old father, and my mother who remains with me as an inspiration always. To the Berkeley Prolepsis Design Collaborative, the most wonderful group of current and former graduate students with whom I've had the honor to work and to learn from. And to the many, many mentors, colleagues, who have taught me so much and who continue to teach me so much in my career. I am truly indebted to all of you. I continue to learn from you, even at this late stage in my career. In my talk today, I will discuss the big ideas that inform my work in literacy and design-based approach to literacy, and broader forms of research on learning that seeks to advance a method of inquiry that is organized, imagining what is not yet, that is the proleptic property of learning that brings the end into the beginning, as Michael Cole has written. However, before elaborating this approach, I take a relevant detour and share a vignette that I hope illustrates a central commitment in my work. That is to use theory and methods in ways that help me learn to see non-dominant communities differently, to learn to see them historically, including learning to see as well as to design for the development of more conscious historical actors, a concept I will return to shortly. This vignette is about the importance of everyday learning and learning from everyday people, which I hope illuminates the theoretical, ethical, and methodological importance of focusing on the everyday, on people's everyday practices. In 2010 and 11, I had the privilege of serving as the president of the American Educational Research Association. Now, as Carol Lee will agree, there are few material perks that come from designing that expansive conference, but one involves being chauffeured to and from the airport the week of the conference. Except that the New Orleans Marriott, which had then been recently opened after the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, had no driver. So Keith the bellman took up this role. I sat in the backseat of the car, reflecting on the long week's events during my ride to the airport. I spotted an old cemetery with large tombstones and vaults, and I wondered aloud who might be buried there. This sparked the beginning of a remarkable conversation with Keith, the driver, whose historical knowledge of the city was carried in a detailed and intricate narrative about his family's history, a story interspersed with proclamations about the importance of education and the need for people to know their own histories and how a good education could provide that opportunity. Unbeknownst to me, here sitting in the front seat of the car was an historical actor, known to most as the bellman in New Orleans, Marriott, where he had worked for nearly 30 years. When I began asking him about his family, he remarked that the Plessy family had been residents in New Orleans for generations. Some were well-to-do, and some poor folk like him, he said. On one side of the family, he shared, had been politically active, especially his great cousin, Homer A. Plessy, a shoemaker in Treme, an area of New Orleans. In 1892, Mr. Plessy had been arrested for sitting in a railroad car in a section reserved for white people. The case, Plessy versus Ferguson, is one of the most important cases in U.S. segregation history and remains a landmark legal case with far-reaching implications for generations of African Americans and other non-dominant communities. Keith asked if I had ever heard of Homer Plessy. He was pleased that I had and impressed with my knowledge of Plessy versus Ferguson. Keith Plessy had learned about his relationship to this historic case from his teachers in New Orleans. He had also learned from family stories and teachers that Faubourg Treme, one of the oldest black neighborhoods in the country, had been populated by free and freed African Americans. As Vore notes, Treme was a cultural and political cauldron where residents were free to own property, publish newspapers, found schools, and agitate for equal rights. Plessy was proud of his family's history and leveraged it toward important ends. Fast forward to the present. Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson, a documentary filmmaker and great-granddaughter of Judge John Howard Ferguson, who had ruled against Plessy, thus preserving segregation, joined forces and founded the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation for Education, Preservation, and Outreach. Their articulated missions to develop innovative ways to teach the history of civil rights through understanding this historic case and its effects on the American conscience. Keith spends much of his time outside his work as a bellman, speaking to audiences about the case and its importance. I was captivated for so many reasons by Mr. Plessy's life story and his commitment to education as a civil right, but of relevance to my talk today, I was both humbled and in awe of the life of this so-called everyday man who in the span of a ride to the airport taught me about history, about the way we read and misread folks, and how much there is to learn from a focus on the everyday routines of people with whom we interact. Homer and Keith Plessy were everyday people who, in doing something ordinary, became conscious historical actors. Their practices were made into something consequential. So the work I talk about today argues that to design in new ways requires us to learn to see differently, as Keith Plessy's story reminds us. It's an argument about seeing our work with youth and communities in ways that can help education researchers see ingenuity instead of ineptness and inability, to see resilience instead of deficit, and to imagine futures with youth from non-dominant communities instead of imposing failure. In our work, we use the notion of learning to see, both metaphorically and as a theoretical lens and methodological guide, to illustrate how rigorous and consequential education research can help us imagine and design new forms of learning and schooling, to imagine new social futures. I argue that rupturing educational inequality also involves new forms of inquiry that help reconceptualize what it means to work with non-dominant communities and to support the development of social actors, and to engage in consequential educational research that has transformative potential intellectually, educationally, and socially. The kind of scene on which I focus is undergirded by an historical epistemology that counters ahistorical and universalist notions of epistemology, the study of nature, of the nature of knowledge itself. As Wartofsky argues, how we observe, discern, or perceive has a history, and if objects of perception are transferred by human thought and action, then perceptions are cultural historical artifacts. From this perspective, are not Homer and Keith Plessy, non-dominant communities, their learning and their worth, the objectification of emotive perception? These are questions with which we grapple in our work as methodologists, critical learning scientists, and literacy scholars. Questions that persist and remain unresolved in any fully satisfactory way across our own community-centered design-based research, as well as in my own work and writing. Inspired by Vygotsky, third-generation activity theory, and Paulo Freire, social design-based experiments, which have been evolving in my work across 3 decades, are organized around a set of design principles and commitments to transforming the educational and social circumstance of members of communities as a means of promoting social and educational equity and consequential learning. Organized around a set of commitments that aim to make possible a sustained and dignified life for all humans by addressing the challenges of leveraging cultural diversity and reducing social inequality. Social design experiments seek to create and study change in partnership with a range of communities in which new futures are co-designed. As educational and social interventions, they design for new learning as well as unlearning stereotypic or deficit perceptions of learners and their communities. As educational experiments, like other design experiments, social design experiments are grounded in empirically derived hypotheses about learning and human development, but are iterated, implemented, and continuously reflected on, refined, and repaired over the course of the work. In other words, these are theoretical and experientially informed models of the future that are co-designed, studied, and co-revised in the present. Their cultural, historical, theoretical underpinnings and equity focus orient researchers to seek deep understandings of the following: the resources and constraints of the ecologies that constitute people's everyday lives. Second, the full range of people's practices understood both historically and across at least several activity systems, and people's repertoires of practice, including the genesis of those practices, as well as their value to members of communities. This approach also calls for new methods and ways of working with participants as co-partners. As education researchers participating in the practices we study, stepping into the messiness, pressures, and joy of participatory empirical work opens up our interpretive sensibilities to the tremendous effort, struggle, and humility this work involves. Fred Erickson suggested that by sharing in the action and cognition of practitioners, students, and community members, that is, studying side by side, we might develop more honest accounts of cultural production and reproduction that move beyond portraits of social life as either waitlist or overdetermined. In this way, a humanist approach to research may offer dignified, nuanced portraits of social actors, as well as make visible the historical constraints we encounter and the spaces available for history-making, improvisation, and change the way we conceive of the people with whom we partner, as well as their potential. Following Uriah Ingestrom, Elizabeth Mendoza suggests that the artifacts of our research should function as prisms that refract the contradictions in the systems in which people participate, shining a light on the potential sites for collective change. Drawing on chat, democratizing forms of inquiry, and a resilience framework that I adapted from Walker and Salt, our work is organized around a set of ever-evolving design principles: historicity, prolepsis, diversity, equity, mediation, transformability, sustainability, and resilience. For us as researchers and for participants with whom we collaborate, developing an historicized view of the present, that is, how the past is indexed in the present, helps us develop and engage in newly imagined productions as well as the designs of our futures as individuals and collectives. This attention to history actually opens up the process of prolepsis, the cultural mechanism, as Michael Cole writes, that brings the past into the present. You can see then why proleptic learning serves as an important design principle in our future-oriented agenda. There is also deep attention to understanding diversity as a resource in the ecological sense, that is, the critical role of diversity in ecological resilience and sustainability. Diversity here is not a deficit. Instead, diversity means greater variability, an essential resource for transformability and maintaining a resilient and sustainable ecology. There is a persistent emphasis on equity across the design process in its theorization, design, and implementation, and across iterations. Throughout my work, I've become increasingly motivated to understand what equity means, what it depends on, what is being made equitable, and what is being made inequitable when we, as researchers and educators, attempt to address issues of historical inequality in our research and educational practice. In other words, I'm concerned about equity for whom. It is important to note that equity is both ideal and pragmatic or material. It's ideal, as in the tool, it's ideal insofar as it is an aspiration and a conceptualization and a commitment to our work, as well as material and a social interactional achievement. This requires us to rethink how equity work is accomplished in our work. So we try to address the ideational and material dimensions of equity, as social design experiments focus on both pressing problems of practice as well as the realization of a social and educational change agenda. The long-standing interest in my work has become significantly heightened in this historical moment when ahistorical, amoral, anti-science, and anti-humanist views are making it easier to dismiss and undermine rigorous, thoughtful, and consequential research, notably around issues of race, gender, equity, and justice. More importantly, these anti-empirical and pernicious views are making it easier to dehumanize and dismiss cultural communities, their histories, their right to dignity. I highlight this point as so much of our work involves working with minoritized and other marginalized communities, requiring us to attend to context in ways that recognize and acknowledge the specific embedded inequities and historical specificities in the lives of members of these communities. This move is too often ignored when scholars take up notions of equity that are stripped of historicized analysis and its critical content, thus preserving what I have termed white innocence. This is a key point, I think, in the conduct of research, including the kind of work I do, as any treatment or intervention can become inequitable unless those inequities and subordinations are taken into consideration, examined, and remediated. Time does not permit me to focus on the remaining design principles, but I want to underscore the important work of remediation in transformative design, with its focus on reorganizing the functional system rather than on fixing individuals, as well as an emphasis on resilience and change, where change implicates the individual, the collective, and the ecology, with the end goal of transformation and sustainability. Now, you might ask why the term experiment, given that social design experiments privilege the social agenda of ameliorating and redressing social historical injustices and the development of theories focused on the organization of robust and equitable learning opportunities and educational justice. Well, first, the goals of social design-based experiments include the traditional aim of design experiments in our field, that is, creating theoretically grounded and practical educational interventions. However, I also use the term experiment as a form of reclamation of the original intent of the term. Early definitions of experiment, if you recall, back to the 14th century, include action of observing or testing, a trial, a piece of evidence or empirical proof. It also once meant a feat of magic or sorcery. From Old French, it meant practical knowledge, and from Latin, a trial, test, proof, experiment, or to try. In preparation for this talk, my long-term colleague, Fred Erickson, reminded me that at its core, experiment is a trial to take action in the world, to act on it, in order to see what the consequences of the action are. He said, it is fundamentally not about modern formal experimental design with random assignment to control groups, etc., but about acting on the world, trying rather than doing armchair theorizing. In Francis Bacon's time, they began to call this study natural philosophy, not logic or mathematics, but a process of trying to see things in nature, to see what happens. These understandings are entirely consonant with the notion of social design-based experimentation, that is, that we try something out based on empirically derived conjectures that grow out of systematic and sustained observation of human activity, involving close and careful study of how knowledge and practices are constituted as youth participate and navigate in and across the varied settings, and activities of everyday life, with a commitment to understanding how these practices came to be, as well as their histories and meaning to people and communities. These ecologically valid studies aim for co-designed interventions that account for the fact that people participate and learn in dynamically organized ecologies, utilizing a range of interdisciplinary perspectives, including ethnic and cultural studies, critical race theory, and anthropological approaches and tools of psychology, for example. Our team documents and tests conjectures about behavior and cognition in ways that findings can speak beyond the laboratory setting, their accounts of human activity. It's an approach to design, then, aligned with the kind of ecological validity first proposed by Brunswick, Barter, Neisser, and later Bronfenbrenner, Cole and Scribner, and Cole, McDermott, and Hood, who were pushing on traditional psychology's, quote, narrow-spanning problems of artificially isolated proximal or peripheral technicalities, which are not representative of the larger patterns of life, as Brunswick wrote in 1943. Over 3 decades later, Bronfenbrenner insisted that in order to be ecologically valid, research must fulfill 3 conditions. First, it must maintain the integrity of the real-life situation it is designed to investigate. Second, it must be faithful to the larger social and cultural context from which participants come. And third, the analysis must be consistent with the participant's definition of the situation. I think here of the stellar work of Carol Lee and Joanne Larson and the kind of ecological studies that are really defining their research agenda at this moment. I think it's important to say here that I was trained in mixed methods and resist unproductory binaries, but I do challenge those in need of attention. Thus, social design-based experiments embrace the tension that arises in the aims of producing knowledge and also pushing for social change in both the Vygotskian and Freudian sense, as it combines traditions of design-based research and democratizing forms of participatory inquiry that seek to make the design experimentation process a co-construction between different stakeholders, institutions, communities, and individuals, with an emphasis on the everyday and consequential learning. After all, people experiment all day and every day. The late singer Prince's vaults are filled with Prince's artistic experimentation. Indeed, jam sessions are about experimentation and improvisation, testing out what works and what doesn't work and what to make public. In our study of the ingenuity of Latinx families' new media practices, we considered youth line stepping as a form of experimentation. Some context here. In our research, we have witnessed agentive, rebellious, and political attempts at boundary crossing by non-dominant youth in our documenting of youth's new media practices. This focus on the everyday practices of youth has allowed us to see line stepping as an instantiation of boundary crossing, where an individual deliberately and consciously pushes against society's ideological constraints. Rather than seeing boundaries as static, we recognize their dynamism. By subtly identifying and testing a line, the line stepper learns how and where lines are permeable and the available latitude in their enforcement. At times, youth will encroach the lines without going over them. At other times, they will cross the lines, attempting to ascertain the severity of the consequences of their boundary crossing. In our study, we saw youth engage forms of line stepping as they challenged established gender norms around video game playing or acted in ways to counter deficit school labels through their online identities. This, we argue, is an everyday form of experimentation, too often glossed over in the studies of youth, thus missing a productive analytical frame that has explanatory power for understanding youth's complex developmental processes. As we have written, our use of line stepping was inspired by Charlie Murphy and Dave Chappelle's skit about the funk music superstar Rick James, played by Chappelle in the skit, which recounts the volatile nature of their relationship, which often resulted in, as Murphy puts it, in James stepping across the line habitually. Chappelle's portrayal of James as a habitual line stepper is productive for marking the outer edges of transgressing boundaries. However, the privilege associated with Rick James' age, gender, class, and sexuality enables his reckless disregard for societal norms. Without such entitlements, most youth are required to tread familiar and societal boundaries with a much lighter touch than the musician. Thus, our conceptualization of line 7 pivots from Murphy's in that it describes a form of transgression that is processual, more methodological, and often executed with deftness and some sense of consequence and caution. The concept of line stepping opens up a new way of seeing ingenious boundary crossing in action, that playful resistance that occurs at the time the boundary line is acknowledged and engaged. Here we draw on notions of everyday resistance from Mariana Pacheco. Line stepping also exemplifies consequential learning, a form of learning central to the social design experiment's transformative ends. Allow me to insert a theoretical note. I draw my understandings of consequentiality primarily from the work of Rogers Hall and Susan Giroux, with a conceptual nod to King Beach, who was among the first to address the idea of consequentiality in learning in his 1999 chapter, Consequential Transitions, a social cultural expedition beyond transfer in education, in which he pushed on long-standing notions of transfer in learning. In her stellar work, Susan Giroux has contributed new understandings of consequentiality. She writes, research, particularly learning sciences research, has not attended to the social production of consequentiality, a focus central to understanding consequential learning as the reorganization of people's participation in social practices that allows them to be recognized as competent and valued participants in dynamic and contentious networks of practice. Rogers and Giroux further argue the importance of attending to power relations in communities, particularly in regards to who benefits and who suffers from how concepts of learning are defined. They argue that consequentiality is not created by individuals alone, given by the practices of the community. It arises as people participate and change conceptual practices. Consider an example of a mural created at the Bowery Mural Wall on Houston Street after Hurricane Sandy by well-known street artist Swoon and over 40 teens from Sandy's affected communities. As Mike Yearsley reported, a community program, Groundswell, worked with youth who went out and visited communities, collecting stories and learning about image gathering and making, working with professional mural makers who helped them synthesize their ideas and who provided the technical advice on how to achieve their artistic visions. When interviewed, Yearsley writes, Swoon discussed the consequentiality of the collective community's production. There's something so direct, she said, about the impact of creativity, that whether you're participating in it or you're feeling yourself change your environment, or if you're just seeing change happen, the fact that you're able to see positive change happen directly contributes to the sense of possibility that people have in difficult circumstances. These notions of consequentiality resonate with situated and critical learning sciences and cultural historical views of learning and development that have oriented my work and that have informed the big ideas and key concepts that have defined my research in literacy and learning, as well as the methods employed. I view learning as the organization of possible futures. Thus, in my work, I have sought to understand the importance of the everyday in expansive learning activity, to understand the role of how and why historicized forms of learning are fundamental to proleptic learning, to challenge reductive and static conceptions of culture that too often serve as the analytical frame to document the practices of young people, of families and communities, particularly those of immigrant, migrant, diasporic, and other non-dominant communities, as well as to understand how to design for the development of what I have termed social critical literacies. As a reminder, in 2005, I wrote that a social critical literacy historicizes everyday and institutional literacy practices and text and reframes them as powerful tools oriented toward critical social thought. Here, traditional conceptions of academic literacy and instruction for students, notably from non-dominant communities, are contested and replaced with a form of literacy that privilege and are contingent upon students' lives, both proximally and historically. Developing social critical literacies is necessarily a transdisciplinary and multimodal achievement, as it involves the conscious use of social and cultural theories, play in the imaginary situation, a range of ideal and material tools, and a kind of cultural amplification, Here I'm making a twist on Colin and how Colin Griffin first theorized that concept, in which valued everyday and cultural practices are leveraged to build historicizing practices that link the past, the present, and an imagined future. Of significance, the object of social critical literacies is the social historical reconstruction of what it means to be fully human in the classroom and in the social world. This transformation move involves engagement in consequential forms of learning and a process of what Manuel Espinosa calls becoming historical actors, who become designers of their own futures by invoking the past in order to remediate it so that it becomes a resource for current and future action. Here, the transformational process of becoming an historical actor involved developing a sense of one's own identity in a broad context of time, including how particular cultural practices came into being and how they have enabled and constrained possibilities for learning, and how these understandings inform future-oriented practices. The coordination of the past, present, and future-oriented actions and identities sets the conditions for new forms of agency, central to realizing new social educational realities. To contextualize the notion of historical actors in relation to the experimental nature of everyday life, it is useful to think about an adapted and expanded notion of a kind of performativity. So when I talk about historical actors and social critical literacy, it should call attention to a shift in terms of our understanding of the nature of literacy practices as a kind of performativity, thinking here both through and beyond Butler, that goes beyond the enactment of prescribed ways of being and knowing. Drawing on the work of Peng Yin, a student at Berkeley, and Cindy Cruz from UC Santa Cruz, I'm talking about a kind of performativity which indexes the affordances of discourse as constructed in a sentimented way, but also includes the mediating potential of embodied ways of knowing and historicized social imagination to create alternative social realities central to the production of powerful literacies and historicized agents in the world. To illustrate a nascent example of literacy practices that help to create social realities, I shamelessly share a brief video of Akira, my granddaughter, as a 3-year-old, invoking the playful imagination to passionately reenact a creative assemblage of meaningful and well-worn texts that are a part of her everyday life. Here, Akira remixes everyday artifacts in her playroom, concepts from popular culture such as the idea of friends list from a feature of Facebook, with narrative segments from her favorite books, such as The Hen That Crowed, written by Sheila Cole and her friend Barbara Rogoff, and Dora the Explorer books and other texts, and ideas from movies and TV programs to create a near story. So apologies to Akira for showing a video of her after we had just woken up, as you saw her meticulous self earlier. She begins, "My friends are missing on the friends list and I can't find them anywhere," as she points to the bingo card of storybook characters that she has remade into her friends list. "Will you help me find all my friends so that we can put them on the friends list?"
I don't know what you mean.
My friends are missing on the friends list and I can't find them anywhere. Will you help me find all of my friends so I can put them on the friends list?
Where's your friends list? That's your friends list?
Yeah, I can't find them. Where they could be?
Where do you think they might be?
I think they're hiding in a different place.
You do?
I think they're in Mickey Mouse hiding in the web clip. So I think all of them, my friends, are hiding in Mickey's muffin machine.
In the muffin machine?
But one is hiding in a different place. I can't find them. One is in the piggy bank.
In the piggy bank? Why would they be hiding in the piggy bank?
It's behind the piggy bank, not in the piggy bank.
Oh, excuse me.
I want it in the piggy bank spot. I didn't know what to do with this money. So it could be full of big money. And then we have to find the last door. And then I have to find the last list to put in the friends list. And then I will find all my friends and put on the friends list.
Who are your friends?
The sniper, tickle, Isa, another swiper, Isa, tickle, Adolph, Boots, Benny, tickle, Isa, Boots, another Benny, and all my friends are be so proud, so aching, everyone. And they shout and would say, yay, and they will shout it, yay, that all my friends are here on the front list.
Now, I spared you from watching that long version of the video, which only her abuelita would appreciate, in which she becomes a protagonist in this fanciful mystery, recruiting characters from her books to serve as her helpers, in what eventually becomes a socially just story about helping people. The point here is that her assemblage of texts and a range of tools mediated by my participation were not used so much as to reproduce or reenact social realities, but as to create a new social reality. The creation of alternative social realities was precisely the aim of the long-term collaborative design work in the fifth dimension after-school programs of Las Redes en el Pueblo Mágico and the UCLA Migrant Student Leadership Institute, and the central production of social critical literacies. Theoretically, these alternative social realities might be considered tertiary artifacts, to use Wartofsky's term, which are imaginative artifacts that color the way we see the actual world, providing a tool for changing current practice. In fact, I think I would argue that social design experiments can become tertiary artifacts where social critical literacies become powerful mediating tools. Developed through theoretical and analytical attention to the history of contradictions and possibilities in schools and other institutions. The very practices of classrooms and of our programs themselves, as well as of the contradictions of texts lived and studied, youth literacy learning involved creating alternative social realities in which they could become historical actors, mediated by their participation in Teatro del Oprimido, or Theater of the Oppressed, a form of political theater used in radical popular education movements in Brazil. In our program, Teatro, a collective problem-solving activity, was a rich site for building problem-solving narratives, important to everyday and more formal learning. Here, youth and adult educators enacted key social issues and engaged participants in a new form of performed learning that supported a collective imaginary of a more just and hopeful world and a newly imagined educational future. To quote Vosugi and Espinosa, Teatro has helped us blend the academic reading and writing with the artistic and the playful in order to see what might bloom. Following its founder, Augusto Boal, Teatro provides the context for the development of a shared vocabulary for interpreting the world as it is and imagining what it would take to make the world more just. The scenes were created were rooted in the stories and questions offered by the group and reflect pressing problems of their time and space. Together, the students asked, where and by whom is history made? How might we learn to see social change in the everyday? These embodied understandings of pressing social problems were later examined in formal texts, personal stories, and historical and current accounts and elaborated in students' own classroom writing, activities that set the groundwork for a form of syncretic thinking involving a synthesis of contemporary cultural life with history, the everyday and more formal. Social design-based experiments, then, are about creating new realities where students' repertoires of practices are made consequential. Like Teatro, social critical literacies, through the use of syncretic texts, seek to rupture the binary between in and out of school learning. First is it to design the support of the development of transformative literacies for high school students from migrant farm worker backgrounds across a 15-year design experiment at UCLA. Syncretic texts were developed around a strategic reorganization of the everyday and the academic, in which students had opportunities to make everyday genres and texts the object of analysis, to understand their genesis, as well as their forms and functions and conventions, such that they could leverage these new tools in school contexts. However, syncretic approach neither romanticizes everyday knowledge nor privileges school-based skills, and instead, from a Vygotskian perspective, a syncretic approach recognizes that expansive forms of learning involve the reorganization and productive hybridization of the two toward expansive forms of literacy learning. And I'm thinking here of the work of Ramon Martinez and Danny Martinez and Lali Morales, who do this so well in their work. I elaborated this approach in several publications, most recently in the Journal of Learning Sciences, so I won't elaborate it again here. Instead, I ground this theoretical concept discussed above and situate them in the following critical testimonio, a syncretic text that reorganized a valued cultural genre with traditional conventions of an extended definition, common in literacy and writing courses. Hector's testimonio was both written and recounted orally, indeed performed to a community of migrant students, program instructors, and counselors. As a practice of social design experiment, the production of the critical testimonio was a collective achievement written in an environment saturated with tools and forms of assistance, as well as canonical and new analytical tools, but with students understanding them all the while as tools for collective transformation and new ways of doing school. After much research and engagement with a range of difficult texts, Hector's critical testimonial, like those of his peers, wrote about what it meant to be a migrant or immigrant in this country. Hector recounted his terrifying and heroic experiences of crossing the border, traveling as an 8-year-old with his younger sister and mother to rejoin their father, whom they had not seen for 5 years. They traveled by plane to Tijuana and subsequently hid in a house for 2 weeks. He says, "At the end of those 2 weeks, it was our time to go. El Coyote took us to the beach in Tijuana, and from there we'd cross the line and step the foot into the United States. We were there for about 3 hours. I was wearing a pair of new shorts, a new shirt, and shoes I had gotten for my birthday. Oh, and let's not forget, 5 pairs of underwear. My dad needed some, and the only way to bring them was by me wearing 5 and my sister 4. However, when the Coyote arrived to take them across the border, the family was told that the children would have to go alone without their mother. Terrified and without shoes and socks, they had to shed them to blend in with the beachgoers. Hector and his little sister, holding tightly to one another, traveled with a stranger to a house where they hid once again. About their stay in the strange house, he writes, "We were not allowed to go anywhere besides the kitchen, living room, restroom, and the backyard. One day, my sister and I woke up early and looked around the house. In one of the bedrooms, there were about 20 men just sleeping on the floor. As soon as we saw them, we ran out." Hector wrote about their life-threatening journey to Los Angeles, with his sister separated from him as she rode in the front of the truck with strange men. He said, "The whole time I was thinking of her, I hoped they wouldn't hurt her. I hoped the men were good people. I hoped that she'd fall asleep and not wake up till the next day." Crammed in the back of a truck with no room to move and little air to breathe, Hector begged for air, got ill and vomited, and was near collapse when a man gave him his own drink. That unknown person saved my life. He was my guardian angel. I will never forget his voice. This man traded his life to save Hector. After reaching Los Angeles in yet another strange house, the children were finally reunited with their older sister and uncle, but only after receiving instructions about what to do if La Migra questioned them. Hector's narrative is all too familiar, exemplifying the plight of millions of youth today threatened by a brutal and unjust immigration system that splits families with gross injustice and inhumanity. Hector wrote about how reuniting with his father felt like reuniting with a stranger, especially for his younger sister, who had no memory of him. When he finally hugged his father, he did so, he said, with all the love a child can give, with all the passion a son can have. Right there, I realized how much I loved him. He recalled his father's hugs as a hug filled with the love that had been saved in his heart for 5 years, a hug filled with the hope that life would be better, a hug that fed his soul and kept him alive. The program's focus on understanding the historical and social political consequences of how they came to be migrants and immigrants had an unexpected outcome of students shifting how they viewed their parents and the difficult work they did as migrant farm workers, as well as the causes of their social, educational, and economic circumstance. He said, "My mother came back after a week, after struggling twice to cross the border. Today I wonder how she was able to let go of my hand that day on the beach. I wonder how she was able to live through a week without knowing if we were dead or alive. I wonder now how she still manages to get through the day. As a migrant farm worker, she suffers from insomnia and hypertension. She always talks about how tired she is, but she always cooks the best meals." Syncretic texts like Hector were at once historicizing, proleptic, and consequential, as his participation in this social design experiment transformed his educational trajectory so he could go to the university, as well as his new understanding of himself and his potential. He closes by saying, "And here I stand today, talking to all of you about my struggle. I thank you for every moment, for every dream, and for every minute that you thought of how much each of us has suffered. From this program, I will take the friendship of many of you. I will leave my heart with you, and I hope that it never erases from your soul. I want to thank all the staff for every breath, every moment, every thought you spent on us. You are wonderful people, and from this program, I will take all the love you've given me and share it with others. Your love feeds my heart, mind, and soul. Thank you to the RAs for taking us as your children and caring for us like we care for you. Thank you for everything you taught us. You taught me so many things about myself. I will never forget you. You will always have a piece of my heart. Thank you, and I love you," he said. Here, Hector's critical testimonial exemplifies the importance of designing for collective transformation, such that individual trajectories and identities are also implicated. In this design ecology, learning was organized as a formative anticipation of a possible future, the realization of a potential through a process of prolepsis, a mediated representation and nascent experience of the future in the present, a concept with which I began this talk. I introduced concepts, aspirations, new tools, and design principles that I hope will be useful to research on literacy learning and designing for the social good in ways that have transformative and enduring consequences for people in vulnerable communities. Such work requires more attention to the empirical work of scholars from non-dominant communities, re-mediating the way we partner, work, and learn with the very communities we seek to understand and support. Such work also requires new ways of seeing activity and tools that help us capture the complexity and ingenuity of everyday people. Consider John Jackson's work, Thin Description, Ethnography in the Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, in which he challenges canonical methods, including ethnography, that conceptualizes culture as text and fieldwork as reading. As such views lead us to believe that meaning resides in what we see if only we look hard enough. Such views privilege ways of knowing and doing that uphold the values of the researcher while silencing those being researched by positioning the researcher as the only possible knower of reality. Jackson notes, in pretending to see everything, we see less than we could, and argues that the notion of thin description is a response to an overconfidence in anthropology, an arrogance born of the powers of thick description. Jackson's critique is not so much an argument about how Geertz and other privileged symbolic interpretation to cross-cultural understanding and analysis has come to be. Rather, the central issue is that the currency of thick description should be reconsidered. In our work, we try to capture complexity in our attempt to work around more symmetrical relations, and this has interesting consequences. Here, Karen Villegas documents one of the number of times the youth turned the gaze and took over the camera and began the process of filming and interviewing the siblings, thus changing our research agenda. This landscape scene details the interaction between 4 young siblings across various technological mediums, including a laptop, video camera, DSi gaming console, and television. By doing this kind of landscape sketch, we can show the crossing over of technological spheres and how the children interact with one another using technology tools. Finally, Jose Lizarraga shows our interest in the movement of tools, not only how people not only people in trying to understand the mediating role of new media in our family's practices. This slide illustrates events that occurred over a 40-minute time period on one weekend night. This animation shows an accelerated representation of the movement of the devices. Taken together, colleagues, what I've tried to argue today is the need for new ways of doing work, particularly with non-dominant communities, one that captures the humanity and ingenuity in people's everyday practices. I've argued for a way of doing our work, I hope, that befits these communities and our profession. Thank you.